History, Unitarian history, world history, whatever you want to call it. History is something that human beings do. There isn't one true history existing somehow out there in the world, in the mind of God, or baked into the universe. We humans do history. That is, we examine the past and we attempt to tell a story about it, explain it. Therefore, we do that because history kind of informs us about the present somehow, informs us about who we are. And therefore, the person doing history, the historian, tells the story with a perspective, their own perspective, or more likely the perspective of their peers, their community, their people. So if I say that Unitarian Universalists told their story from their point of view, and then I tell their story again, I'm telling it from the point of view of Cherokee and Indian in the UUA. The Unitarians and the Universalists in what we call the United States arose out of the community of white settlers, rose out of that community. White settlers, whether Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, or the Americas, have some characteristics that set them apart. They are Europeans who travel from Europe with the intention of forming new community, a new home, a new livelihood in a place different from Europe. They may call it New England, but it is far away from England. They recreate Europe, at least in their imagination, but it's new. It's a new community. There are always in this white settler situation, there are always people who are already on that land. There's not a single case where white settlers went to some place where there was nobody. There's always people on that land, people with their own history, their own struggles, their own culture, their own way of being. And so the white settler engaged in a conquest of those people. From the beginning of colonialism to in the early 15th century to the present, the white settler is conquering or defending conquest. White settlers engage in occupying the land with force and attempting to coerce the labor from the natives, and failing that, the settlers engage in genocide of the original people. The vision of what they're doing, a vision that is their project. They don't say, we're colonizing this land with the hopes of becoming wealthy. We're settling with hopes of upward mobility in the class status system. Rather, they talk of bringing Christ to the savages, to the primitives they find, to the other people. In their mission of later in the years after the American War for Independence, they talk about civilization and progress. They're going to bring civilization to the continent. The English in Africa and the South Asia actually talked about empire as if it was an ideal worth expanding and protecting. To observe that in the United States, Unitarians and Universalists in the 19th and for most of the 20th century were nurtured in the white settler consensus and contributed to maintaining that consensus with sermons, books, lectures, and planned community celebrations. When I was a youngster, I'd go to Unitarian Sunday schools and they would have pageants around Thanksgiving. They would dress us up as Indians and pilgrims and do that thing in a Unitarian church. So that this helps us understand the behavior of those heralds of the liberal faith, Jefferson, Emerson, Thoreau, Samuel Eliot, because they were nurtured in this culture too. That was the culture that nurtured them. Jefferson, who first advocated Indian removed forced migration of the original people to west of the Mississippi, grew up and was nurtured understanding the doctrine of discovery is giving the English the right to the land, and he is an Englishman, the right to land speculation beyond the Appalachian. Ralph Waldo Emerson, who propagated manifest destiny in his essays and the civilization of Anglo-Saxons as a superior race upon the world. He could write journals about the inferiority of the Irish, the African peoples, and the natives. Or Henry David Thoreau, favored among Unitarians, Universalists, who fancied himself self-sufficient at Walden when the women of his family were cooking hot dishes to be delivered to his door. Thoreau declared that no Indians remained in New England because the survivors of the conquered people now and cooked their food over cast iron stoves. Therefore, they weren't Indians. He, on the other hand, was truly savage. He called himself savage because he took periodic trips and ate the fruits of the forest. Samuel Eliot was the first president of the American Unitarian Association, considered Indian policy his civic duty. He was called to Indian policy, and he sat on congressional commission which supervised reservations and boarding schools. And his only concern with these reservations and boarding schools seems to be that they're better health service and more blankets and chalkboards kidnap children in the schools. So he looked at these concentration camps as necessary and wanted to improve their internal services. And Eliot said that he was so glad, when his last letter to the Indian Commission, he said he looked forward to the day when there wouldn't be a need for an Indian Commission because the Indians would have disappeared into the great America. There was never in any of the essays of any of these people that taking land and locking up the original occupants, removing land, pushing them west to the Miss was vicious, destructive, genocidal. Moving a people from their land is itself destructive of their culture, and they have to rebuild it in a whole new place. Taking children away is genocide, according to the United Nations Charter. Now, we know Samuel Eliot, we know that Ralph Waldo Emerson, we know them as that they articulated white supremacist ideas. And they kept good people. Eliot kept good people in dissent out of the Unitarian ministry, arguing that they would lower Unitarian standards. The history of Universalism is another story of institutionalized racism, both internally and in policy toward the larger society. So we come to the 1960s, when these Unitarians and these Universalists merge into one association, the Unitarian Universalist Association. The culture is still white settler culture. They have not examined the story of white settlers. They continue to celebrate pilgrims and pioneers. Pioneers is still a word that's used to describe the Unitarians, pioneers of liberal faith. And the Unitarian Universalist Association preached on the best practices, preached on the traditions. But at that merger time, there were only 4 congregations in the whole of the 1,200 total that had more than 10 African American members, only 4. There was a scattering of American Indians, African Americans in the Southwest congregations, and there were some Asian students in some of the California congregations. It was a white denomination. In these years, just after the merger, of the Unitarians and the Universalists, the African American people were developing their civil rights struggles. The United States had moved on from the kind of white settler colonialism to include worldwide colonialism, which is in island countries far and wide, interests all over the world, a war machine to protect the colonial stretch of the United States. And the Unitarian Universalists would brag about how many of their members were in the administrations of the United States. There was one article in the World about how many people who were Unitarians have been Defense Secretary of the United States. That's also at the peak of the time of the merger was the worldwide anti-imperial movement. Asia, Africa, South America, there was a rise in countries becoming independent of their mother country, of the colonial country, and there was struggles of resolutions at the United Nations. So it was both going on in the 60s, even in the early 60s. And the youth movement of the Unitarian Universalists was concerned about the war in Vietnam, and the United States seemed to be more and more involved in it, being pulled into it. So what happened is young come back and they talk to their parents and they talk to their congregation. And pretty soon the congregations was talking about the war and the independence movement, about Cuba. All kinds of things were being talked about that were just never talked about before the 1960s in Unitarian churches. So the traditional stance of supporting U.S. policy was challenged by more and more Unitarian Universalists in that period. And the traditional see no evil, speak no evil posture towards segregation and racism was being challenged from within. There was a kind of, let's do something, let's go on that picket line. And there would be controversies about even joining a picket line because it was something that they'd never done before and people considered it dangerous. Maybe unrespectful. We cause controversy and split in the congregation if we let the youth go on a picket line, if the adult suppliers, adult advisors join them. So it was controversial. I was 18 in 1960. I was 28 in 1970. And my childhood had been a dance in fields. My extended family was Texas Cherokee. My grandparents and elders spoke Cherokee. They told the story of white settler violence that had chased them out of Tennessee and the Trail of Tears, and how our band had come to Texas 25 years before the Alamo and 22 years before the Trail of Tears. So there was fear in that community, fear that children would be taken to boarding schools, fear of being harassed, fear of laws against traditional ceremonial practice. Stomp dances were done, but there would be people watching to make sure that nobody saw them being done. So that was my extended family, my grandparents, my uncles, my great-grandparents. Meanwhile, my mother was a Unitarian, and I was faithfully brought to Sunday school. I was part of the Unitarian Universalist Youth Group, LRY, which as Angela mentioned, when the civil rights movement was big in the news and most of the youth were eager to join in support, and most of the adults, not so much. What I saw during my young adulthood was a young UUs convincing them to come out against the war in Vietnam, to come out in support of the civil rights movement, and even to have discussions in the church about the Black Power. And there were there was the UU love for Martin Luther King. King was invited to the main speaker at the 1966 General Assembly. King's ideas were published and distributed to UU congregations in the UUA. The concept of beloved community became part of UU vocabulary. And then King came out against the Vietnam War. Usual liberal criticism, he didn't say, this is a mistake. No, King called it an imperial war, a continuation of colonialism. He said that the war was racist. And this was a time of uprisings in white America called the urban riots. And King said that the anger was the result of white violence and racist violence against the Black community. Nonviolence was a tactic of struggle, not a surrender to injustice. For the established leaders of the UUA and many white UUs, this made King controversial, and they tried to find, on the one hand, on the other hand, stance toward, he was good on this, but he was a little too, shouldn't talk about Vietnam. Some UU congregations invited King engagements. There are good studies of the Black Empowerment movement within the UUA, and it is worth a forum on this group yourself. You should have a look at the Black Empowerment movement. But needless to say, the UUA limped into the 1970s and 1980s, divided and in fear of what it called controversy, because they didn't know how to handle all that differences that was had emerged between people about how to handle the Black empowerment struggle, the war in Vietnam, any of the struggles that were going on. They didn't. It was just unusual to have controversy and have arguments in churches, and ministers being fired for bringing up these controversies. So for some UU, they continued the U.S. foreign policy was a good thing. That, as I said, there was still this kind of support for that. It was to support the domino effect, and Vietnam would fall to communism. But other people UUs were arguing as colonial and racist. There was enough happening in the world to bring anti-colonial struggles into the congregation social action movement. So it was over time, but people just heard it over and over, and we became used to having these conversations, even though there was resistance at first, and probably a lot that continued for a time. If some UUs supported the demands of Black empowerment, there were others struggles to support in the 1970s. Free Angela Davis, that went on for 4 years. There was Malcolm, he was speaking around. That was an important thing. But there's also the rise of the Chicano and struggles among people of the world who would soon become known as Latinos. And there was a rising of struggles among the native peoples, coming to national attention with the occupation of Alcatraz in 1969, the march across the United States to Washington, D.C., and the occupation of the Bureau of Indian Affairs and Wounded Knee 2 in the 1970s. These movements saw the organization of centers in many big cities welcoming natives of all nations. My own story is mostly involved in that work. The UUs were still mostly fearful of what they call controversy. The General Assembly passed resolutions, and there was discussion. And then finally, in 1992, there was a resolution that the UUA would seek to become multicultural. And in 1996, to engage in a journey toward wholeness to overcome racism. there's 1,000 lectures and 1,000 discussions could be had what happened during that time. There was lots of work that was done, and there were lots of struggles and talk about racism in the UUA over those 2 decades. But with this first circle of Indigenous UU's caucus in Drum, we were small, and most of it was sharing stories of being stories of racism. It was inner focus on being NDN in the UUA. It wasn't focused on how to get the UUA to actually support Indigenous struggles. And a lot of the work of the anti-racism movement was inner focused too. In the last several years, there's been some serious institutional work done, however, and it's tied to our common work of descendants and overcoming white supremacy culture. In the General Assembly of 2012, the UUA repealed the Doctrine of Discovery, the principal justification of the European conquest of Africa, the Western Hemisphere, and lots of other lands as well, Australia, New Zealand. Indigenous activists, nations, and coalitions were asking religious organizations to examine this legal nonsense called the Doctrine of Discovery, go beyond the actual support for Indigenous struggles. The courts use the Doctrine of Struggle to depower Indigenous people. For example, what happened with the Corps of Engineers up in North Dakota in taking that land to build the pipeline almost through the Standing Rock Reservation. The legal basis for that's the Doctrine of Discovery. So to engage in actual support for Indigenous struggles is also to support the legals against the power of empire that's been set up against the Indigenous peoples. The UUA and congregations supported Wounded Knee and later did serious work to support political prisoners as the government tried to victimize the water protector. General assemblies in Portland, Spokane, and the last virtual GA had extensive programming on Indigenous struggles and brought the Indigenous activists to the General Assembly. So all of this is part of decentering whiteness and the struggle to understand how whiteness got formed in the United States through conquest. Right now, I'm working on a program, Harvest the Power. You can see it on the UUA website. That includes a critique of the Unitarian role in creating the myth of the first Thanksgiving, complete with saintly pilgrims bringing congregational polity and civilization to the imagined wilderness of North America. Wilderness with roads and agriculture. Many UU congregations now set aside the second Sunday in October for Indigenous Day. Many UU congregations have also instituted land recognition, what is called land recognition. That is naming the people whose land the church is built on, telling the story of their conquest and removal. Now that's all been happening in the last several years. Sometimes the Indigenous people named are not far away. The congregation can have organized ongoing solidarity efforts. Often the Indigenous people that congregation is occupying their land are far removed. It takes some research to make the congregation aware. If a congregation in Chattanooga, Tennessee's got to figure out that it's the Cherokee that were removed some 800 miles away. It takes some research for the congregation to be aware, and we're organizing that, providing the resources to do that. Taking responsibility for genocide and violence is a profound process, and it has been entered into and it requires special recognition. While I observe that the myth of the American purpose, the motivating idea behind manifest destiny, the idea that comes out of the white settler conquest of this land, is still very much a part of yours. The idea that there is something called the American purpose to create a, and it's never been the case that this American purpose has been realized. It's all, so if you want an American purpose that's always out there to be strived for, that's interesting. I might be hearing messages with a less than generous ear. I might be. But what I hear from too many white UUs saying is we should have done the takeover of this land with less damage to the original people. We should have conquered this place, but we shouldn't have done removal, boarding schools, things like that. Which is a little like saying we should have built up this land and made it rich without being mean and kidnapping and enslaving Africans, or conquering and grabbing the Southwest. We should have done all those things, but done them nicer, done them with less damage. UUs are still telling old stories of Unitarian Universalists back in the day, without critique, without examination of their vision. I have had the experience of asking UUs who are telling me to celebrate Olympia Brown, who was the first woman ordained in the Universalist faith, and they want to celebrate that. The question is, she was born in a log cabin in Michigan. How did her father built the log cabin in Michigan by chopping down trees, built a school, funded a Universalist circuit rider. 12 years after the Kickapoo were removed from by the U.S. Army. Olympia Brown was born in a privilege of having an army to give her father land. We do anti-racism on one Sunday and UU heritage hero worship on another without examining the UU heritage hero worship's ties to genocide and slavery and racism. But Unitarian Universalists were nurtured into a movement within the white settler culture and people of this United States. And to invoke an evangelical metaphor, overcoming white supremacy may mean dying to the old way of being UUs and being born again anew. Go in peace.